Sounds great. Welcome to the day 2 of this Planetary Health Annual Meeting, co-hosted by the University of São Paulo and the Planetary Health Alliance. I am Daniela Viana, postdoctoral researcher from the University of São Paulo. I'm very pleased to be introducing this workshop entitled Deconstructing Climate Misinformation to Identify Reasoning Errors. I would like to introduce Dr. John Cook, a research fellow at the Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University in Australia. He is also the author of the Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change and founder of the Skeptical Science. I wish you all an amazing workshop. John, the word is yours.
Thanks very much, Danny. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to start by sharing my slides and make sure I'm sharing sound because there is some sound in this. The way we're going to structure this workshop is over the next hour, I'm going to spend the first 15 to 20 minutes just talking about misinformation and research into misinformation. And in particular, I'm going to talk about a way of deconstructing misinformation in order to identify how the misinformation misleads. So it's really a process for, if you see misinforming claims, how do you analyze them in order to find out where they mislead? And once you've done that, then you can then build, well, firstly, you can make sure that what you're looking at is misinformation or not. But then secondly, if you want to respond to misinformation, if you want to do fact-checking, debunking, or preemptive inoculations, identifying those reasoning fallacies in misinformation is the first step to being able to write debunkings. And so after I talk about the research and the theory, then we'll put it into practice. And the second half of this workshop will be, I'm going to give you examples of climate misinformation, and then interactively as a group, we'll go through them and deconstruct them together. So I'm hoping that you all will get involved and help work with me to deconstruct some misinformation. Putting it into practice is a really effective, powerful way of I guess, internalizing the research that I'm going to be talking about. But one last thing, as I'm giving my presentation, if you have any questions about what I'm talking about, please write your questions in the chat window. And then as soon as I finish the presentation, I'll go through your questions before we get into the interactive part. So you can either write the questions and then you can also speak your questions after my presentation as well. All right, let's jump into it. I've done enough preamble. The first thing I wanted to talk about was examining the research into how misinformation does damage. You really need to understand that in order to understand how to respond to misinformation. And I found a really useful study for this is a paper published in 2017 led by Sander van der Linden. And what Sander did was he showed people different messages about climate change. One message was the 97% consensus amongst climate scientists that humans are causing global warming. So one group in his experiment was shown the 97% consensus. Another group in his experiment was shown some misinformation casting doubt on the consensus. And the misinformation was taken from an actual website, the Global Warming Petition Project, which featured over 31,000 Americans with a science degree who had signed a statement saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. The point of this website is to argue that there's no scientific consensus on climate change because so many people have signed this petition. What he found was when people were shown the fact, the 97% consensus, there was a strong positive effect. So that's the first bar in this bar chart. So we see that when you tell people that there's scientific consensus on climate change, you see a strong positive increase in not only what they think the consensus is, their perceived consensus, but also their acceptance that climate change is happening, their acceptance that humans are causing it, and also their support for climate action. The second group in the experiment were the group that were only shown misinformation. And what they found for this group was the misinformation had a significant negative effect. It reduced people's perceived consensus, it reduced their acceptance of human-caused climate change, and reduced their support for climate action. So this tells us that misinformation does work. It has a negative effect on confusing people, and in the case of climate change, reducing their support for climate action. The third group was shown both the fact and the myth. And in this case, the two cancelled each other out. When people were told that there's 97% consensus and they were shown the global warming petition project, the result was no change in people's beliefs. The fact and the myth cancelled each other out. And what's happening here is when people are presented with conflicting pieces of information and they have no way of resolving the conflict, then they disengage and they don't believe either the fact or the myth. And this is a bit like those old episodes of Star Trek where Captain Kirk gets cloned and there's the real Kirk and there's the fake Kirk, and Mr. Spock has to try to work out, well, which is the real and which is the fake. It's the same when people are confronted with real news and fake news, and they're trying to tell which is real and which isn't. If they don't have a way of... Sorry, was there a question there? No. If they have no way of resolving that conflict, then then the risk is that they disengage and they stop believing in real news and in facts. And so this really is one of the most insidious ways that misinformation does damage. Misinformation doesn't need to be coherent or based on evidence or even convincing. It just needs to exist, and it can stop people believing inaccurate information. Misinformation can interfere with proper learning. And so while that's a really disturbing aspect of misinformation, it also points to the solution to misinformation. If the problem is that people can't resolve the conflict between fact and myth, then what we need to do is give people the tools to be able to resolve that conflict, to be able to tell the difference between facts and misinformation. And a useful framework for doing that is inoculation theory. Inoculation theory is a branch of psychological research that takes the idea of vaccination and applies it to knowledge. Just as exposing people to a weakened form of misinformation can build up their, let me go back again. Just as exposing people to a weakened form of a virus helps them build up immunity so that when they encounter the actual virus, they don't get infected. And this is something the whole world has been obsessed with over the last 12 months. In the same way, exposing people to a weakened form of misinformation builds up their immunity, their resilience, so that when they encounter actual misinformation out in the real world, it's less likely to influence them, to mislead them. So here is an example of the inoculating message that was used in this experiment. For a fourth group in their experiment, they showed them an inoculating message that it was basically, it delivered the misinformation in weakened form. I apologize for some of the background noise there. And by weakened form, I mean they explained the different ways that the misinformation was misleading. And while there were a number of different ways that the global warming petition project is misleading, the key way is, I think, the most misleading aspect of this petition is that almost everyone who signed it, those 31,000 science graduates, had no expertise in climate change. It was anyone with a science degree. So there were people with computer science degrees, engineering, medical science, veterinary science, but less than 1% of the signatories had any relevant expertise in climate science. What the researchers found was when you inoculate people before showing them the misinformation, it mostly neutralized the misinformation, and the facts were able to have a positive effect again. And so what this tells us is you can preemptively inoculate people, build their resilience to misinformation by explaining how the misinformation misleads people. And so this raises the question, if the key to stopping misinformation from spreading is to explain the reasoning fallacies, the misleading techniques in misinformation, how do we do that? How do we reliably and systematically identify reasoning fallacies or rhetorical techniques in misinformation in order to write inoculations or fact checks or debunkings? And to address that question, back in 2018, I published a paper with two critical thinking philosophers, Peter Ellerton and David Kincaid from the University of Queensland. And we developed a methodology for deconstructing and analysing misinformation in order to identify any fallacies or misleading rhetorical techniques in misinformation. And this is a simplified version of our methodology, or our step-by-step flowchart. And there's really just 3 key steps in identifying fallacies in misinformation. The first step is deconstructing the argument. Every claim is basically an argument, and every argument takes the form of starting assumptions or premises and a conclusion. So for example, an argument might be, I have blue eyes, therefore I know quantum physics. The premise or the starting assumption is I have blue eyes, and the conclusion is I know quantum physics. I'm not saying that's a good argument. That's just an example of an argument structure, premise and conclusion. The step 2 in our flowchart for deconstructing misinformation is checking for logical validity. If the premise is true, does it logically follow that the conclusion is also true? So let's take my example. I have blue eyes, therefore I know quantum physics. If the premise is true that I have blue eyes, I don't, let's just say it is, does it follow that I know quantum physics? No, it doesn't. That argument is logically invalid. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And so that means that that argument is logically invalid and it's false. Now, the third step in this flowchart is checking the premises. If the argument is logically valid, then you look at each of the premises and see whether all of those are true. And if any of these premises are false, then you've identified where the argument goes wrong. And you can have more than one premise be false as well. What this process does is it, firstly, by deconstructing the argument, you get to see what all the assumptions are in the argument. And secondly, by going through this 3-step process, you can identify where exactly the misinformation goes wrong. Where is it misleading? And this is a much more systematic, organized way of analyzing arguments to find out where they're false. Now, that was a simplified version of the flowchart. This was the actual full flowchart that we used in the paper. I'm not going to go into all these details, but I just wanted to show this to let you know that, that there is more to it than just those 3 steps. But the real guts of it, the meat of this flowchart are those 1, 2, 3 steps. And also, yeah, you can, if you just, I guess let me jump back. You can just search for this paper, Deconstructing Climate Misinformation, and it's open access. You can read it online for free. And I'd like to think it's a fairly readable paper, so it's not too technical. Let me give you an example of this process in action. So, and we'll take that global warming petition project as the example. Now, the argument is that 31,000 dissenting scientists prove that there's no scientific consensus on human-caused global warming. So let's do step one, deconstruct this into premises and conclusion. The premises or starting assumptions are: one, a large proportion of people with a science degree disagree about humans causing global warming. And the second premise is that if a person has a science degree, that makes them an expert on climate change. Those are our starting assumptions or premises. And the conclusion is that there's no scientific consensus on human-caused global warming. So that's step one done. Step two, is this argument logically valid? If the premises are true, does it logically follow that the conclusion is true? If a large proportion of science graduates disagree with human-caused global warming, and science graduates are automatically experts in climate change, does it logically follow that there's no consensus on climate change? The answer is yes, this is logically valid. If, and that's a big if the premises are true, then it does logically follow that the conclusion is true. So that takes us to the third step. Are the premises true? And what we see here is actually both premises are false. Firstly, there is not a large proportion of science graduates who disagree with human-caused global warming. 31,000 seems like a big number, but there are millions of Americans with a science degree. Just noting, I know that we have a very international group in this workshop, but the petition project had a very American-centric project. So it was only talking about Americans with a science degree. But even within just that community, there are millions of Americans with a science degree. And so 31,000 is a fraction of a percent of that bigger community. Secondly, the second premise commits the fallacy or the rhetorical technique of fake experts or argument from false authority. Just because someone has a science degree doesn't automatically make them an expert on climate change. As I mentioned earlier, the petition project was filled with people who had degrees in computer science or mechanical engineering or veterinary science, areas of science that had nothing to do with climate change. And so going through this step-by-step process allows us to systematically see where exactly in the argument does it mislead. And once we've identified the reasoning fallacies in misinformation, then we can start thinking about, well, how do we communicate that to people? How do we take those fallacies, the fake expert strategy and the magnified minority strategy, what are effective ways to communicate that to people in order to either inoculate them against misinformation or to debunk the misinformation and explain to people how it's wrong. So we took that step-by-step process and applied it to 50 of the most common myths about climate change in order to identify all the fallacies in the myths. And again, you can go to our paper to see them. And I wanted to talk about one more thing before we jump to the next part of the workshop. In order to identify reasoning fallacies, you need to know what are the possible reasoning fallacies or denial techniques. And I found that a really useful framework for listing or for understanding and being aware of denial techniques is FLIC, the 5 techniques of science denial. And FLIC is an acronym that makes it much easier to remember: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. Obviously, FLIC only works in English, In other languages, the acronym is different. In Germany, it's PLERV. I don't remember the actual German words, but yeah, the acronym often renders quite interestingly in different languages. But the idea of it is that that misinformation and denial techniques all come under these 5 categories. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Over the last decade, I've been building a landscape of different rhetorical techniques and logical fallacies, as well as in purple over here on the right, different traits of conspiratorial thinking. And these are all techniques that you will find in misinformation. And the more familiar you are with Flick and the different fallacies in misinformation, the easier it is to be able to identify how misinformation misleads and do that deconstruction process. And if you want more information about Flick, in the bottom right corner of this slide, you can see a short URL, sks.to/Flick. There you'll find the history of Flick, all the definitions of the different denial techniques, as well as climate examples. So that's a useful resource if you're interested in building your resilience against misinformation or responding to misinformation. So the next step will be doing some examples. I'm going to show you some examples of climate misinformation. And as a group, we're going to try deconstructing them. That's always a bit experimental. I'm not sure how it's going to go, but we'll give it a go. But I'm going to stop sharing for the moment and happy to answer any questions that people might have about this. And I think what I will do is answer questions in the chat. And then once we've gone through those, if anyone has any further questions, you can just ask them by audio. Like you can just unmute yourself and ask a question to me. But let me start by answering Leslie's question. Leslie asks, or actually Leslie, do you want to just ask it out loud, or I can read it out, but I think people would probably rather hear from you.
Just to generalize a personal experience, when you've got a committee, in this particular case, who, if one person is the lone voice of reason, and of course I'm biased about that, and everybody else in the committee is leading with misinformation, it's tricky to deconstruct that. And as much as your argument for that, the petition, you know, it's actually a very small proportion of people, blah, blah, blah. But if those people have power, can make decisions with that, that's very dangerous. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously that's more of a political thing as opposed to an information thing. How do you deal with being in a minority when the majority you know, might hold false beliefs? And that's super challenging, particularly when the people who hold the false beliefs have a greater position of power. And I don't have an easy answer to that, I'm afraid. And it's kind of outside of my lane as well. But I can speak to some of the ways that it's even more problematic than, like, you're talking about it in a kind of a more interpersonal kind of situation, like in a group. More broadly, from a communication point of view, there's research into what happens when people of power hold false beliefs and then talk about that. In the case of climate change, there's been several studies, one by Bob Brule, another by Matto Mildenberg and Tony Leisowitz, where they analysed what drives public opinion about climate change, because there are different factors. But they found one of the biggest influences on people's attitudes about climate change is what they call elite cues. In other words, cues from their political leaders. What our political leaders say about climate change is one of the biggest drivers of changes in public opinion. So when you have a political leader promoting climate misinformation, that's highly damaging. If it's a president of a country, that's super damaging. That can have a big influence. And we see climate change, at least in the US, there was a big drop in public opinion in 2009. And the reason why, it turns out, was because of a surge in climate misinformation from political leaders. So I know that that's completely not answering your question, but it's just making the matter worse in terms of like just underscoring the problematic aspects of I guess climate misinformation. Yeah, I'm sorry that I can't give you a satisfying answer. I will say one other thing though. Here's a more hopeful response. One of my colleagues, Emily Braga, who I've done some misinformation research with, she has done a lot of work on a thing that she calls observational corrections, which is her technical term for when we as citizens correct other misinformation in our social network, and other people see that. When we call out misinformation, whether it's in a conversation, in a committee, on social media, and our friends and family, our social networks see us calling out misinformation, that has a positive effect. That is influential. And so calling out misinformation can stop it from spreading. And in a way, it is like inoculating people within that immediate network and slowing the spread of the misinformation. So certainly calling out misinformation can help stop the spread. Of course, it's important how we do it. Being too confrontational can be problematic, particularly in an interpersonal situation. But that general principle of us all contributing to helping stop the spread of misinformation holds. So does anyone else have one? Oh, here we go. Danny has a question. Danny, do you want to unmute and ask it yourself?
Yeah, you can explain, because you have good examples about studies related to the tobacco company and oil companies trying to deny science. So I'd like to hear from you about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so the tobacco industry invested millions of dollars into confusing the public about the health impacts of smoking, and were very effective. They delayed regulation of smoking in the tobacco industry for decades. That enabled them to continue their profits while millions of people died from it. So A, it's an example of how misinformation can really have a damaging impact on society, and B, how money can amplify misinformation's impact. The fossil fuel industry have dwarfed the amount of money that the tobacco industry spent on misinformation. The fossil fuel industry have poured billions of dollars into organizations that promote climate misinformation. And so from the 90s up till now, so we're like for 3 decades, misinformation has poured from these like conservative think tanks, organizations that promote climate misinformation, and they've been funded by the fossil fuel industry, and that's really helped them amplify the impact of misinformation. So there's a lot of parallels between the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry. Both industries knew from their internal research that their product did damage to society, but instead of acting on the science and changing the way that their industry worked in order to keep society safe, instead they invested in misinforming the public and confusing them and just muddying the waters so that people got confused about how deadly their product was. The other parallel is the solution to both problems is the same. When the public realized that they were being deceived by the tobacco industry, when they realized that tobacco knew about the health impacts, but they lied to us. That was the turning point for society in terms of changing public sentiment about the tobacco industry and kind of winning the war on tobacco misinformation. And so there has been a lot of effort into communicating that the fossil fuel industry knew about the impacts of fossil fuel burning as far back as the 1950s. And yet they from the 90s, they've poured billions of dollars into misinforming us. And telling that story is one of the ways of inoculating people against misinformation. In my own research, the first inoculation study I did was inoculating people against that same misinformation I spoke about earlier, the global warming petition project. But in my inoculation, I didn't mention the global warming petition project at all. Instead, I talked about the tobacco industry and how they use the fake expert strategy to confuse the public about the scientific consensus on smoking causing cancer. And I found that even inoculating people against fake experts strategy in tobacco misinformation was effective in inoculating them against the same strategy in climate misinformation. So explaining the techniques of science denial and the rhetorical tricks used to mislead us doesn't just work in one area. It can actually have a broad applicability across different topics. In a way, this critical thinking approach is like a universal vaccine against misinformation. Is there any other, does anyone else want to ask a question?
I do have a question. I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but this technique is face-to-face, right? Or how could I apply this technique to the world we live at, that we get this misinformation through TikTok, which are 30-second videos that really spread the worst possible way, right? How do you think that applies?
This approach can be used in so many different ways, and I have used them in so many different ways. So yes, you can use it in conversation, but I actually, as a communication researcher, have used it mostly in developing communication. So I've written textbooks that explain the techniques of denial. I've written articles and op-eds and letters to the editor that explain it. But then I've got as brief as tweets and single graphics and short videos. It's just really a matter of communicating that rhetorical technique. And I found that one of the most powerful ways of doing it is with memes and single cartoons. And I haven't touched on this before, but if you want to explain the logical fallacy in some misinformation in a very quick, accessible, short, concise way, but it's also very engaging and user-friendly, parallel arguments or analogies are really powerful. In other words, take the logical flaw in the misinformation and transplant it into a parallel situation, an analogous situation. And that can help you take that abstract logic from the original misinformation and make it concrete, make it everyday. The most viral tweet I've ever tweeted in my history, like Twitter is not a long history, but over the last decade, is I was responding to the myth. This was about March or April last year. In the US, just as the curve was starting to flatten, the COVID curve, people were saying, well, the curve is flattening, we can reopen society. And I took that logic and I transplanted it into a parallel situation. And I drew a cartoon of a man with a parachute falling from the sky. And he's saying, well, my fall has slowed down, I can take my parachute off. It was that same logic. The thing that's saved you, well, seeing as I'm doing okay, I can get rid of it. If you get rid of it, then you'll be in trouble again. And that was exactly the same logic as the we can reopen society because the curve has flattened argument. It was a single cartoon. It was engaging and funny, but it was also taking that that bad logic and making it very concrete, making it clear and user-friendly to people on how it was misleading. So again, there are lots of different ways to respond, like to inoculate and use critical thinking, both short and long form. Any more questions?
I do have one, John.
Sure.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
I read, in fact, last year, an article mentioning that in Taiwan, a lady who was kind of a minister or something like that, engaged in creating content to counterbalance misinformation, denialism, by creating posts which use the same strategy as usually those denialists do, which is appealing to the emotion. So what they did, it was a formal organism or institution from the Taiwanese government. And they used humor to play with the post of those that were denying thing or spreading fake news. So they were kind of dismantling the fake news by using humor so as to attract people the same way the posts were attracting. I don't know if you read or knew about that. No, it's just a comment. I don't know if you know about that.
I'm not familiar with that specific instance, but I have done a lot of research and read a lot of research about using humor in response to misinformation. And well, yeah, I mean that the example I gave was an example of humor. Well, combining critical thinking and humor is one way of doing it. But what's really interesting about the research into humor as a form of science communication is there are a lot of benefits to using humor, but there are also potential downsides. It almost feels like it's a double-edged sword. Every benefit kind of comes with a downside. For example, climate change is a very intimidating, kind of scary topic for people, and humor can make it more accessible, and it's a way of engaging people who are disengaged about climate change. So that's a benefit of humor. But researchers have also found that a humorous climate message makes people less concerned about climate change compared to a serious message. So that thing that made it more engaging also downplayed its severity. So there's that kind of positive and negative aspect. So whenever I use humor to communicate climate change, I try to grab the positive benefit and avoid the negative benefit, if at all. Another example of a benefit of humor is there is less counter-arguing to humorous messages. So people see the humor is less serious, and so they're less likely to come up with arguments against it. And so that's kind of a way in a sense. It's like by packaging your message as humor, people are more open to it. But on the flip side of that is people see humorous messages as less credible and less informative. So even the researchers have found that if you give people a humorous message and a non-humorous message, and it's exactly the same content, people see the humorous message as being less informative than the serious message. So again, it's this kind of double-edged sword. Generally, I think as long as you're aware of all the benefits and risks, you can try to construct your humorous messages so that you get all the benefits and try to avoid those or minimize the downsides.
Yeah, as far as I know, I may have not said it correctly, but they're not using humor to communicate. but to destroy the fake news.
Yeah, I mean,
But anyway, I don't have more information about that. I just found the information here, and I'll just copy it to the people here as an article.
It's funny reading the literature, the research into humor, because they kind of take something that humor is kind of just instinct. You know, we find something funny or we don't. But scientists always know how to squeeze all the joy out of anything. So they look at why do people find something funny? What are the different types of humor? You know, there's satire, there's wordplay, there's anthropomorphism. There's all these different types of humor, and mocking people and othering people can be a kind of a toxic or negative form of humor. So yeah, I think that humor as a blanket approach is like, there's different ways, different approaches within that, and we need to find ways that are constructive and positive, but also engaging and can have, you know, educational benefits.
John, can I make another question?
Of course,
I think that denialists are strongly arriving in Brazil, and we can see that they have method, and they have techniques, and they have money. Here they are using WhatsApp for spreading fake news. So my question is, are we losing this game? Or how should scientists or climate scientists try to convert this game and to win this? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, misinformation can spread in lots of different ways, whether it's on television or through, you know, public forms of social media like Twitter and Facebook, but also more private chats like WhatsApp. And those are the particularly problematic ones, because they're kind of happening below the surface, and there's a lot less transparency about that. And so because misinformation is such a multifaceted, complicated problem, it means that there is no one magic bullet. It's a multi-front war, and we need a whole range of different solutions, both at mainstream media level, at public social media level, and in private social media interventions as well. And so, how the way that climate scientists can contribute, again, is in lots of different ways. Firstly, climate scientists need to recognize that they are the most trusted voice or source of information about climate change. So they have a great amount of potential influence. So I think it's really important that climate scientists are engaging with the public. How they do that, it can be in lots of different ways, and they just need to find ways that suit their particular skill sets. Maybe they're good at media interviews. Maybe they're good at public talks. Maybe they're good at interpersonal conversations like on WhatsApp. Maybe they're good at none of those things and they need to get training. And so, yeah, I just think that it's hard because often there are no professional incentives for climate scientists to engage with the public, and yet the importance of them doing that is like paramount in terms of helping accurately inform the public. So it would, like, on my wish list would be universities or academic scientific institutions providing more incentives for scientists to engage with the public. Just putting that out there is something that I think would be more constructive and helpful for helping push back against misinformation.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry?
Just saying thank you.
You're welcome. So I think I better push on because we are getting, we've only got 15 minutes left. So I think we'll probably just have time for one example of a piece of misinformation, and I'm going to play a video, and then what we're going to do is we're going to try to go through that 3-step deconstruction process. Just going through the process is quite instructive because it makes you realize how difficult it is, I think. Learning critical thinking is like learning a language, and you can't expect to learn how to speak Portuguese in an hour. And similarly, you couldn't expect to learn critical thinking, but at least this is a good, I think, first step into recognizing this issue and its importance. So let me figure out how to share my screen again, and I will play you a video of some misinformation, and then we will deconstruct it as a group together. Okay.
We keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record. I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
So here is a piece of climate misinformation that appears on an annual basis whenever it gets cold. And the argument is basically it's cold outside, therefore global warming isn't happening. And this was in February 2015 in response to 2014 being the hottest year globally on record. So who would like to volunteer to try to deconstruct this argument? Step one being, what are the premises and what is the conclusion in this argument? You want to resist the temptation to jump right to what is the fallacy, and instead just systematically go through the 3 steps. Anyone want to have a stab at the premises and conclusion?
So would it be saying it is cold outside, there's no global warming? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, well, basically the simple version of it is, the premise is it's cold outside, and the conclusion is therefore there's no global warming. Okay, so all right, so that's step 1 dealt with. That's great. So step 2 then, is this argument logic? You'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. Is this argument logically valid? Does it, if the premise is true, it's cold out, does it logically follow that there's no global warming? Anyone want to answer that question? Is this argument logically valid?
Well, I can answer. It is not logical, because when global warming happens, doesn't mean that the entire world is going to become very cold or very hot all the time. Some parts of the world will have different climate change, and some seasons will still be quite cool. So there is no correct logic involved.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, just because global warming is happening doesn't necessarily mean that it's never going to be not cold somewhere. Yeah, cold weather isn't going to completely disappear under global warming. So step 2, we see that the argument is logically invalid. Now, I didn't touch on this before because it's a bit of a complicating factor, but what we do in our step-by-step process is, if the argument's logically invalid, what you want to do is try to change it so it becomes logically valid. In other words, there's usually a hidden premise or an unstated assumption in this argument, and when it's logically invalid. And by finding that hidden premise, usually what you do is you cut to the heart of exactly where the misinformation goes wrong. This is the key often to responding to misinformation, identifying the unstated assumptions or hidden premises. So in this case, and this is the hard bit, this takes a bit of thought, but what is the hidden premise in the argument? It's cold, therefore global warming isn't happening. What is the extra premise that you would add into this argument to make it logically valid?
Well, it had to be in the wrong season. I mean, it should then be cold during summer.
Well, in this particular case, it was February. So it was in winter. So it was snowing in DC, which happens every winter. So, I mean, it might have been a little bit colder than usual because of the, I think there was some polar vortex weather systems going on. But I think that you will find people use this every winter, like conservatives or climate deniers.
Excuse me? I'm not sure if you are asking about the difference between climate and weather. This is the point, or it can be something like this?
Yeah, I think it's along those lines. There is a second premise in this argument. The hidden assumption, it is kind of confusing weather and climate. Because we're getting short on time, maybe I'll just sort of jump to it rather than.
John, maybe lots of people are talking in the chat. Maybe if you look there.
Oh, right. So maybe I need to stop my screen sharing so that I can see the chat. But because we have 8 minutes left, I'll probably I'll just have to press on just for interest of time. Now, what this argument is doing, actually, I'll go back to sharing my slides. What this argument is really assuming is that there shouldn't be any cold weather under global warming. That's really the unstated assumption here. So it's not just saying it's cold, therefore global warming isn't real. It's saying it's cold and global warming can't have any cold weather, therefore global warming is not real. That is logically valid. If the two premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. And by doing this, now we see where this argument goes wrong. It's assuming that cold weather can't exist during global warming. And that is kind of confusing weather and climate in a way. And the fallacy of this argument is it's mostly impossible expectations. Expecting that cold weather should disappear entirely is an impossible expectation under global warming. It's also a kind of cherry picking or anecdotal thinking, just looking at your immediate experience and ignoring what's happening on the global picture as well. And so what this example demonstrates is by going through those 3 steps, deconstruct, look for logical validity. If it's invalid, find the hidden assumptions or unstated premises, and then check whether the premises are true or not. That helps you find out where does this misinformation go wrong, and then you can explain the fallacy in the argument to people. And I mentioned before using parallel arguments or analogies as a way of explaining misinformation rhetorical techniques in a way that's very user-friendly, very accessible and engaging. And I find that cartoons are the perfect delivery mechanism for parallel arguments. So here's the logic of that argument. It's cold, global warming doesn't exist. That logic is exactly the same as arguing it's dark, the sun doesn't exist. That is obviously a ridiculous argument, and people recognize it immediately as fallacious and false, but it's exactly the same logic. It's looking at your immediate surroundings and ignoring the bigger picture. And so this is how analogies or parallel arguments are one way of just inoculating people, explaining fallacies, debunking misinformation in a user-friendly way. And late night comedians use this technique all the time. They'll talk about, well, this public figure said this misinformation. Well, that's just like being in this situation and saying the same logic. And everyone laughs, they can see the bad logic. And it's a very engaging and entertaining way of explaining fallacious, bad logic. I'm gonna stop sharing again. I think we only have a couple minutes left. And I'm sorry that this is kind of a whirlwind sort of introduction to critical thinking and the psychology of misinformation and inoculation. But I guess we have 4 minutes. Maybe I could answer a couple more questions, or if people have them.
I have a question, actually. Sometimes people try to disclaim climate change due to we don't have a particular explanation for something that's quite specific. So we cannot, for example, say why there was increase on temperature in medieval eras. Therefore, we cannot explain that. They say probably we cannot explain what's happening right now, or that there is just, we cannot explain something quite specific, that everything we are saying is wrong. How we respond to that kind of approach?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In our critical thinking paper that I wrote with Peter and David, we intentionally kind of just looked at the low-hanging fruit of misinformation, which were the logically fallacious arguments, or what the philosophers call the deductive arguments, arguments that were definitive declarations, like global warming is not happening, or global warming is caused by the sun, and you know, these kind of definitive statements. Another form of misinformation is the kind that you talked about, which is more casting doubt or emphasizing uncertainty, or what the philosophers call inductive misinformation, because it's more probabilistic rather than definitive statements, and those are harder to debunk or inoculate against. And so, like, I don't have a definitive answer to your question yet, because that's still research that we're doing. But my general answer, kind of hand-wavy answer, is I think there is a lot of power to explaining how science works. People, the general public or non-scientists tend to think of science as just facts and truth. But we need to explain that science is a process. It's a process of, you know, building hypotheses and collecting evidence and checking our hypotheses against the evidence, and also the way we collect evidence or make predictions is not providing exact answers, but providing ranges of estimates. When scientists talk about uncertainty, they don't mean they don't know what's going on. They mean uncertainty is a range of values. That's how science works. And unfortunately, the words that scientists use, like uncertainty, are exploited by deniers who exploit the fact that the public often understand those words in different ways and say, well, if they have uncertainty, they don't know what's going on. We do know, but we know within a range of values. And so explaining those elements, that science is a lot like risk assessment. We don't put on a seatbelt because we have a 100% guarantee that we're going to be in a car crash. There is a probability that we might be in a car crash, and we mitigate that risk, that low probability, by taking measures. And so I think explaining science methods and framing it in ways such as risk management are ways to respond to those types of misinformation.
Thank you,
I think,
Dr. Prof.
yes, sorry.
Oh, just saying thank you. Yeah.
No worries. I think we're out of time. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it short. I apologize if anyone else has any questions. Before I stop, Danny, did you have any closing remarks you wanted to give?
No, I just must say thank you. It's amazing, John. And if you'd like to stay more with us, it would be amazing. So we can do another one soon. So thank you so much. It's our honor to have you here with us in this event. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for putting on this great event. It's incredible that people from over 120 countries are attending. It's an amazing event. So really honoured to be part of it. And thanks everyone for attending. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions. Thanks very much, and I'll stop recording now.
Thank you.